Number 5 on our list is the Emancipation Proclamation. In the years leading up to the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a major split between the northern and southern states. This was caused by a major disagreement in regards to slavery. This ultimately led to the Civil War, a 4-year battle between the Union and the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation was an order from President Lincoln during the Civil War to the Confederate States to free all their slaves. Lincoln issued the proclamation on January 1st, 1863. The proclamation itself didn't actually free many slaves because it was an order to the Confederate States and they were in a war against the Union, so as a result, they refused to follow the order. The proclamation did show, however, that the United States of America knew that slavery had to and was going to come to an end sooner or later. The proclamation was one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed which moved the United States in the direction towards abolishing slavery. It led to the 13th Amendment, which was the official piece of legislation that abolished all slavery in America. It also led to so many more advancements like suffrage and citizenship for all African Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation was just the first step in the right direction for freedom and equality towards blacks. For this reason, we thought it was crucial that it was included in our top 5. Number 4 on our list is the end of the Atlantic slave trade. For this event, we looked back to more than 200 years ago to when the slave trade in America was abolished. The transatlantic slave trade was the way things were imported and exported from North America, Africa, and Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. America would get slaves shipped from Africa, and they would ship their goods to Europe and Africa in return. This cycle was very fluent and successful until the slaves started resisting. The slaves had always tried to escape capture, but most of the time it was to no avail. Then in the 1780s and 1790s, the resistance increased and became difficult to handle. Denmark was the first country to end the slave trade in 1803, and Great Britain followed 3 years later. Then, on March 2, 1807, the United States Congress passed an act prohibiting the import of slaves. Although there were many illegal slave trades still occurring after this decision was made, the flow of slaves being imported screeched to a halt. This decision stopped thousands of more Africans from being imported into the United States and becoming slaves. This decision also was a major step in completely eliminating slavery in America, which was a major factor in helping to shape the United States into what it is today. Number 3 is the Voting Rights Act. There are very few times in history that an act is needed to enforce an amendment. One of the most influential acts in American history was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which helped enforce the 15th Amendment. African Americans had lots of trouble voting even after the 15th Amendment had been passed. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation by whites all stopped the blacks from attempting to use their right to vote. Due to all these extra tests and requirements, blacks would participate in peaceful protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. and other powerful civil rights activists. One particular event that angered many Americans was the march from Selma, Alabama to the Capitol in Montgomery. The protesters were met by the Alabama state troopers, who attacked them with nightsticks and tear gas. This entire event was captured on television for the entire world to see. Because the event was aired live, President Lyndon B. Johnson could no longer ignore the protesters. On March 15, 1965, in a speech to Congress, the president called for a voting rights legislation. The Voting Rights Bill was passed by the Senate on May 26th, and Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. This act banned literacy tests, authorized an investigation into poll taxes, and provided oversight for voter registration. This act was such an impactful document in American history as it granted African Americans an unrestricted right to vote. We put this act high on our list because its impact on African Americans was massive. It officially ended the struggle that they had endured for hundreds of years to gain the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act's impact is surely everlasting. Number 2 on our list is Brown versus the Board of Education. Though not the most important civil rights advancement in United States history, Brown versus the Board of Education is absolutely one of the top 2. It all came to fruition in 1896 with the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, where they determined that the principle of separate but equal in regards to whites and blacks was constitutional. Over the course of the next 50 years, disputes between whites and blacks were at an all-time high. In Tulsa, Oklahoma specifically, there were multiple race riots that spread nationally and affected many people in America. In response to the Plessy ruling, the NAACP began challenging segregation in graduate and secondary schools. One key contributor to this movement was Thurgood Marshall. Soon enough, Marshall was named special counsel of the NAACP, and his ideas were then endorsed by them. These ideas were mainly in regards to segregation in education. Many people believed that if segregation were to actually come to an end, it would all have to start with schooling and not just random public facilities. So as a result, their focus was set. In 1951, the case finally began. After 3 years of fights and debates, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled segregation within public schools unconstitutional. Not only did this case set the basis for the desegregation of many other public facilities, it also resulted in a major change socially in the United States. No longer would there be separate schooling for black and white children. They would all be coming together, and for many people, this was not a desired situation to be in. In the North, it wasn't viewed as that big a deal, but in the South, there were many districts who resisted the ruling, and many organizations were formed in retaliation. To combat this, the federal government was forced to step in and begin enforcing the ruling. After many years had passed, eventually all public schools in the United States had been integrated. Soon enough, all public facilities in the United States would also be integrated as well, and it all started with the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. And now, number one on our list of top 10 civil rights advancements are the Civil Rights Amendments. When it comes to the most important or significant civil rights advancements, there's no doubt that you have to go all the way back to where the ball first got rolling with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Prior to these amendments, not only did African Americans not have their rights, but they had been enslaved for hundreds of years. Ever since the Constitution was drafted in the late 18th century, the question of slavery and the rights of African Americans had been the premier question in the United States. Multiple slave rebellions had taken place, including Shays' Rebellion, that would go on to further the push for abolition. After Manifest Destiny had been achieved, there was much debate about what to do in regards to the relationship between slavery and the new states. The Compromise of 1850 settled this dispute for the time being, but as the 1850s continued to progress, it was evident that there was a significant difference in opinion, mostly between the North and South, in regards to the question of slavery. In 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected to be the 16th President of the United States. He had run on the platform that he wanted to contain slavery where it currently existed and not allow it to expand. As a result, with this election, South Carolina seceded from the United States, and thusly many southern states began to follow. Ultimately, a civil war broke out between the Union and the Confederacy. After multiple years of fighting and many casualties for both sides, the Confederacy eventually surrendered to the Union. With the southern states in shambles, this would allow for the 13th Amendment to be passed on December 6, 1865, therefore completely abolishing slavery in the United States. Although African Americans had been freed, they still did not enjoy the same natural rights as whites. This being their next mission, they began to push to have equality under the law just as the whites had. This led up to the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. It also forbid states to deny anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. However, even with the passing of this amendment, African Americans were still not granted the right to vote. Therefore, in 1870, with the passing of the 15th Amendment, African American men were granted the right to vote. These amendments must be at the top of the list, simply because they formed the basis for not only the civil rights advancements of the time, but also in the future. The abolition of slavery finally freed blacks to try to pursue what they wanted. All three amendments would go on to change the social, political, and economic aspects of the United States for years to come. Every single thing that African Americans have gained up until today would not have been possible without these three amendments. This concludes our list of the top 10 civil rights advancements.